Keep your hands where I can see 'em, old man. You're under arrest for disturbing the peace." The handcuffs clicked shut around Jack Weston's wrists. He didn't flinch, didn't speak, just stared straight ahead with the kind of silence that made even the young officer shift uncomfortably. In the courtroom, the whispers started before he even sat down. To most in the room, he was just another bitter old veteran dragged in for losing his temper in public. But what no one realized, not the judge, not the prosecutor, not even the bailiff leading him in, was that this man had once saved a battalion with a single shot, and the only man who truly understood the weight of that silence was already walking through the courthouse doors. He came with 4 stars on his shoulder and a truth no one in that courtroom was ready to hear. Jack Weston was the kind of man you didn't notice until you had to. 68 years old, lean as a fence post with silver hair that refused to stay down, and a stare that made most people shift in their shoes. He lived on the outskirts of Briar Ridge, a sleepy southern town, where the most excitement came from Friday night football games and the occasional parade. His cabin sat just beyond the tree-lined weathered wood, a sagging front porch, and no mailbox. Locals joked that Jack hadn't spoken more than a few sentences in the last decade. He liked it that way. Jack wasn't unfriendly, just unreachable. He went into town once a week, always on Tuesdays. He'd buy canned goods fuel and black coffee from the only gas station that still had a working pump meter. He never lingered, never joined in small talk, never responded to greetings unless absolutely necessary. The high schoolers called him Sergeant Silence. Older folks called him that old sniper. Everyone else just kept their distance. People in Briar Ridge had a lot of theories. "He's got PTSD," someone said once. "No, he's just bitter," said another. "I heard he lives with a loaded rifle by the bed. I heard he talks to ghosts." None of it could be proven. No one had been invited inside his cabin, and frankly, no one had the courage to ask. What they did know was that Jack had once served in the United States Marine Corps. Beyond that, details were scarce. There were whispers about classified missions tours that stretched across continents, and rumors that he once held a world record sniper shot. But in Briar Ridge, such stories had a way of morphing into folklore. And Jack Weston, he never confirmed a thing. To the town, he was a relic, someone too proud to ask for help and too tough to be pitied. So when the news spread that Jack had been arrested right there at the gas station, people leaned in. The incident itself was at first glance almost laughable. A young man no more than 25 claimed Jack had threatened him, said the old man had stepped in over a parking space, that he'd made some remark about knowing how to drop a target without missing. The cashier on duty said she didn't hear it clearly. A mother nearby said she felt unsafe. The sheriff, a man half Jack's age, saw no reason to wait for clarity. He showed up 10 minutes later with 2 deputies in handcuffs. Jack didn't resist. He didn't explain. He just held out his hands like a man who'd been through this ritual before, not exactly this scene, but this feeling, this judgment, this silence. And that's how Jack Weston ended up in a holding cell overnight, wearing the same boots he'd worn every Tuesday for years, waiting for a trial that no one thought would matter. To most, it was just a blip in the week's news. Another grumpy vet story. Maybe it had hit the county paper. Maybe it wouldn't. What no one could have guessed, not the officer who made the arrest, not the prosecutor preparing a list of petty charges, was that this man they treated like a tired old troublemaker had once saved dozens of lives in a single day. And he never told a soul, because Jack Weston didn't live to be known. He lived to do what needed to be done and then disappear into the trees. The arrest didn't make national headlines. It barely made the front page of the Briar Ridge Gazette. But for those who saw it, it left a mark. It happened on a dusty Wednesday afternoon, right outside the gas station near Route 18. The sun was unforgiving that day, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Jack Weston stood by pump drummer, 2 arms, crossed eyes fixed on a young man yelling into his phone about entitlement and respect. Witnesses later claimed they didn't hear Jack say much, if anything at all. But the young man, flustered and red in the face, waved his arms and pointed. He accused Jack of threatening him, claimed the old man had muttered something about being able to end him from 800 yards. That was all it took. 10 minutes later, 2 patrol cars and an SUV rolled in. Sheriff's deputies stepped out, hands already near their holsters as if they'd arrived to confront an armed fugitive. Jack stood still, leaning lightly on the pump, not surprised, not alarmed. One deputy shouted, "Hands up." "Sir, turn around slowly." Jack obliged without a word. The cuffs went on, tight, too tight for someone his age. A few onlookers winced. No one stepped forward. One officer shoved him toward the cruiser harder than necessary. Jack stumbled briefly but never lost his balance, never spoke. Not even when the reporter from Channel 5 showed up, sticking a mic past the open window of the squad car asking, "Do you have anything to say about what happened today, sir?" He said nothing, just stared ahead. By the time the court date arrived, the local media had already done its work. Headlines like "Former Marine Loses Temper at Gas Station" and "Veteran or Threat" floated around social media, especially after someone leaked a still frame from the security footage showing Jack's furrowed brow. They painted him as a grumpy recluse, with a chip on his shoulder, a man whose silence was now framed as intimidation. Inside the courtroom, the tension was thick but unspoken. The judge, a woman in her 40s with a schedule packed tighter than her patients, looked at the case file like it was a paperwork nuisance. The prosecutor, a clean-cut man who looked like he'd memorized his law degree, was confident this would be a quick win. He saw Jack as a closed book, and frankly an easy conviction. Jack's public defender didn't even bother to sit beside him until the judge entered. She had met with him once before. He hadn't said more than 3 sentences. "I don't want to talk," he had told her. "Just tell the truth." But how do you tell the truth when no one wants to listen? When Jack entered the courtroom escorted by a bailiff who clearly didn't want the assignment, a few people in the audience leaned in. Some had heard of him from town lore. Others were just curious to see what the dangerous old sniper looked like in person. He wore the same denim shirt and worn jeans he always did. His boots, though dusty, were polished at the toe. His posture, ramrod straight, looked out of place in a room where everyone else slouched in disinterest. The judge sighed. The jury looked bored. The prosecutor smirked. The public defender scribbled something on her yellow pad without looking up. Jack said nothing, didn't argue, didn't blink. To them it looked like indifference, arrogance, maybe even guilt. But to those who knew what silence can carry, the weight, the discipline, the pain, it was something else entirely. Unfortunately, no one in that courtroom knew Jack Weston. Not yet. A man who fights for his country is honored when he returns, until the parade ends and the silence begins. The courtroom saw Jack Weston as a shadow of his former self, an old man in a plain shirt, too quiet, too hardened, and too strange for the world to trust anymore. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was the version of Jack that existed years ago in the scorching heat of Fallujah. It was 2004. A convoy had been ambushed outside a narrow alley near the city's northern edge. Bullets tore through concrete like paper. Chaos echoed down the alley walls. Shouts, screams, the clattering panic of men pinned down. Communication was down. No air support, no medevac, just smoke and prayers. And Jack Weston, then Gunnery Sergeant Weston, was already on a rooftop nearby. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't need them. Through the thick black haze of diesel fire and dust, he moved into position like a ghost. He carried a modified M40A3 sniper rifle and years of muscle memory in his bones. His scope found the first shooter, then the second. A rooftop to the west gone. A shadow and a broken window neutralized. 12 shots, each one accounted for. But it wasn't just the shots that saved lives that day. It was the last one, the one no one believed could be made. A lieutenant was trapped behind a collapsed wall. 3 of his men were wounded, and insurgents were closing in fast from a rooftop 936 yards away. The angle was steep. Wind was erratic. Jack adjusted, calculated, took the shot through the open hatch of a rooftop, a target moving in full sprint across crosswind. Bullseye. The hatch slammed shut with the weight of a body. The alley fell quiet for the first time in an hour, and the survivors were able to crawl their way out. That lieutenant survived. His name was Paul Hendricks. Years later, retired and living in Montana, Paul would still remember Jack's name. In an imaginary letter submitted to the court but never read, he wrote, "He never asked for a medal. He never waited for recognition. He just did the job. I owe him my life. We all do." Back in the courtroom, Jack sat motionless. No one around him knew that part of his life. The media hadn't bothered to ask. The public defender didn't dig that deep. But that silence, that same silence the jury was so eager to judge, had once steadied his hands during a sandstorm while lives hung in the balance. The world is quick to cheer when a uniformed hero returns home. Flags wave, signs say thank you for your service. But what comes after? What comes after the uniform is folded in a drawer, after the medals are boxed and forgotten, after the body starts to ache from things you can't talk about? Men like Jack aren't broken. They're burdened with memory, with ghosts, with the weight of knowing what it took to keep others breathing. And in a world too distracted to notice that burden often gets mislabeled as bitterness. That's what happened in Briar Ridge. An old man who once saved lives with quiet precision was now being judged for keeping quiet in the face of accusation. No context, no history, just assumptions, just whispers. And yet Jack said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because he'd already said enough in the places that truly mattered. Out there on rooftops and ridgelines where silence meant survival, where every breath counted, where the measure of a man wasn't what he claimed, but what he proved when no one else could. The sound of tires crunching over gravel barely registered with anyone inside the courthouse. No sirens, no flashing lights, just a black SUV pulling into a spot no one else would have dared to take right in front of the courthouse steps beneath the weather-worn stone carving that read Briar Ridge County Courthouse, Esther, 1897. General Alan McCrae stepped out of the vehicle alone. There was no escort, no aide, no press team scrambling behind him. Just the man himself, tall, composed in a crisp civilian suit over a subdued military green shirt, the glint of 4 silver stars faintly visible on the collar. He moved like someone used to purpose, like a man who had seen battlefields most people only heard about in late-night briefings or declassified footnotes. McCrae wasn't a politician. He had never cared for cameras or speeches. He led from the front even long after his official retirement. For years, he had commanded elite special operations teams, working behind the scenes in operations too dangerous to name. But even among the most seasoned warriors, the name Alan McCrae carried a weight that made others stand straighter when he entered a room. And today he had come to speak not to a room full of generals or soldiers, but to a courthouse filled with strangers who had no idea who Jack Weston really was. Inside, the trial was already underway. The prosecutor was halfway through his closing remarks, spinning a narrative of a bitter, unstable man clinging to past glories and lashing out at the world around him. The jury looked tired. The judge glanced at the clock. Even the public defender, still silent, seemed resigned. Then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. No one turned at first. People came and went through those doors all day. Journalists, observers, late jurors. But when General McCrae entered, the air shifted. The bailiff, who had been slouched by the wall, stood up instinctively. The clerk at the side of the judge's bench stopped typing. The judge herself raised an eyebrow. McCrae didn't say a word. He simply walked to the front of the courtroom with the gravity of a man who had every right to be there. The prosecutor paused, clearly rattled. The public defender finally looked up. Jack Weston, sitting still in his seat, tilted his head ever so slightly but didn't smile. Their eyes met for a second. No words passed between them. Then the judge leaned forward, her voice cautious. "Sir, can I help you?" McCrae nodded. "I believe you can, Your Honor. And you are General Alan McCrae, retired, former Commander U.S. Special Operations." The courtroom went silent. Even those who didn't recognize the name could read the tone. Authority, respect, something no lawyer in the room could manufacture. "I'm here regarding the defendant, Jack Weston. He doesn't know I came. He wouldn't have asked. But I'm asking to speak, not as a favor, as a responsibility." The judge, stunned but composed, nodded. "Proceed." McCrae turned toward the jury box. He didn't bring notes. He didn't clear his throat. He simply spoke. "I've read the reports. I've seen the footage. I understand what this courtroom thinks it's judging, but I'm here to tell you, you have no idea who that man is." He gestured toward Jack, still seated, still silent. "You see an old man who doesn't defend himself, but I see a man who once stood between life and death for people like me. In Fallujah, he held the line when it should have broken. 12 confirmed kills in 5 minutes. One shot that saved an entire unit pinned under fire. That shot didn't just end a firefight, it saved my life. It saved the lives of my men." He paused, let the silence hang, then added, "He never told you that because men like him don't speak for applause. They speak through action, through silence, through sacrifice." General McCrae stepped back slightly, turning to face the judge again. And today that silence is being mistaken for guilt. I couldn't let that happen. The jury didn't move, but their eyes, once glazed with disinterest, now watched Jack Weston like they were seeing him for the first time. General Alan McCrae stood at the front of the courtroom like it was a battlefield, steady, precise, and calm under pressure. But what he said next wasn't part of any legal strategy. It came from memory, from scars he never talked about, and from a debt that had lingered for over 3 decades. He faced the jury, then shifted his gaze to the gallery. 31 years ago, he began, I was pinned behind a collapsed wall outside Fallujah. My unit had been separated. Radio comms were dead. We had 2 wounded men, and enemy fire was raining down on us from every angle. There was no air support, no medevac. We were alone. He paused, letting that sink in. His voice didn't waver, but something in his eyes softened. We had minutes, maybe seconds, before they closed in. And then out of nowhere, a sniper started picking them off, one by one. Each shot surgical. Every bullet a lifeline. I counted 12 in just under 5 minutes. The last one. He turned to Jack Weston, who still sat motionless at the defense table, hands folded neatly in his lap. The last one came from over 900 yards away. Through a rooftop hatch. Crosswind. Moving target. It should have been impossible. He looked back at the jury. But it wasn't, because that sniper was Gunnery Sergeant Jack Weston. A ripple went through the room. The judge shifted in her seat. A few jurors leaned forward. One of the local reporters lowered his camera, stunned. And when we finally made it out, no one knew who had saved us. He never waited for recognition. He didn't even stay to be thanked. That's the kind of man he is. Jack Weston didn't react. No nod, no acknowledgement. Just the same forward stare, steady and unreadable. McCrae continued. Now I hear people calling him a threat, saying he refused to cooperate. You think silence means guilt? That man has carried the silence of fallen friends for decades. He's earned the right not to explain himself. He looked around the courtroom. Putting him on trial, treating him like a common criminal, it's not just a mistake. It's a failure of memory, of decency, of the country he once protected. Then without fanfare, without warning, General McCrae turned toward Jack Weston and lowered himself to one knee. A sharp inhale ran through the room. A few jaws dropped. The bailiff took an unconscious step forward, unsure of what he was seeing. McCrae didn't kneel out of weakness or showmanship. He knelt because there were no words strong enough to measure gratitude. Because for too long, Jack Weston's silence had been met with suspicion instead of reverence. And someone had to change that. I came here today, McCrae said, voice softer now, because I couldn't let history forget what men like him have done for this country. I owe him my life, and this courtroom owes him something far greater than judgment. For the first time, Jack moved. Slowly he stood, not out of pride, but out of mutual respect. He stepped forward and extended his hand. McCrae took it and rose to his feet. The 2 men stood face to face, not as defendant and witness, not as old soldier and general, but as something deeper, brothers forged in silence, shaped by war and bound by an understanding that civilians could never fully grasp. At that moment, the courtroom was no longer just a legal space. It was a place of reckoning, of realization, and of long overdue recognition. Jack Weston didn't need the jury's verdict to tell him who he was. But finally, for the first time in years, the room saw him clearly. Not as a man on trial, but as a man who had already proven everything worth knowing. The courtroom sat in silence. It wasn't the usual hush of a legal proceeding, where people simply waited for a verdict to be read or the next witness to be called. This silence was heavier, more reverent. Something had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. The judge, who had up until this point appeared brisk and detached, now looked down at her bench with a furrowed brow and glassy eyes. Her hands gripped the edge of the desk, not in frustration, but as if steadying herself against a wave of emotion she hadn't anticipated. She glanced once more at Jack Weston, then at General McCrae, still standing beside him. With a quiet breath, she reached for her gavel. In light of the testimony provided and the extraordinary context revealed here today, she began, her voice trembling just slightly. This court finds it in the interest of justice to dismiss all charges against Mr. Jack Weston, effective immediately. She didn't strike the gavel hard. It wasn't a declaration of authority. It was a closing of a chapter that never should have been open. The bailiff, the same one who had escorted Jack into the courtroom with firm hands and a rigid stance, now approached him differently. There was hesitation in his movement, a quiet respect replacing routine procedure. He reached down and gently unlocked the cuffs that circled Jack's wrists. They fell away with a soft clink. Jack didn't rub his wrists. He didn't flex or sigh. He simply looked the bailiff in the eye and gave the faintest nod, a thank you maybe, or just acknowledgement. It was enough. He stepped away from the defense table slowly, the weight of the moment finally catching up with the room. The prosecutor remained seated, visibly rattled, thumbing through his paperwork as if it would explain what had just happened. The public defender, silent for most of the trial, watched Jack rise with a kind of awe. Even she now realized she had been assigned a case, not a man, and she had missed everything important about him. As Jack turned to leave, the double doors at the rear of the courtroom creaked open. They hadn't made a sound earlier, but now with the tension broken, their movement seemed deafening. What waited on the other side wasn't a crowd of reporters or protesters. It was silence. And lined up just outside the doors were men, 7 of them standing shoulder to shoulder. Veterans. Some wore hats from decades-old service. Others had campaign pins on their jackets. Most were dressed plainly humbly, but every one of them stood at attention, straight-backed eyes forward. They hadn't been summoned. No one called them to testify, but word had spread, quietly, as it often does between men who once wore the same cloth. As Jack stepped past the threshold, they saluted. No one said a word. Not the veterans, not Jack, not the guards. Even the judge remained standing behind her bench, hand resting on her chest, like she was trying to still her own heartbeat. Jack paused just long enough to make eye contact with the first man in line, a gray-haired Army sergeant who had served in Vietnam. He held his salute a second longer than protocol required. Jack gave him the same nod he'd given the bailiff, then another to the next man, and the next. And then he kept walking, out into the morning sun that had started to peek over the courthouse roof. General McCrae walked beside him, not behind, not in front, but in step, a silent escort for a man who had walked alone for far too long. Jack Weston didn't speak a single word that day. He didn't need to, because for the first time in years, the silence he carried was finally understood. We live in a world that moves fast, too fast sometimes to notice the quiet ones. We judge people on how they look, how they speak, or whether they speak at all. We make assumptions in the span of a glance. He's angry, she's cold. That one's strange, that one's dangerous. And we rarely stop to ask what shaped them, what battles they've already fought long before we ever crossed their path. Jack Weston never raised his voice. He never argued. He never begged for anyone to see who he really was. And because of that, the world assumed the worst. It's easier that way, isn't it? To label someone bitter instead of asking why they're quiet. To call someone broken instead of wondering what kind of weight they might be carrying. Veterans like Jack walk among us every day. Some wear caps that hint at their service. Others wear the invisible scars of combat trauma and years of silence. Many return from war not to cheers and medals, but to confusion, disconnection, or even indifference. And with each year as they age, their stories fade further into the margins. Mental health for veterans isn't just about therapy and medication. It's about being seen, being heard, being remembered not just for what they did overseas, but for who they continue to be here at home. Too often, silence is mistaken for hostility, solitude mistaken for failure to readjust. But maybe what we're seeing isn't failure, it's quiet survival. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just justice for one man. It was a moment of national reflection, a reckoning. Because before we call someone bitter or broken, maybe we should ask what they've carried home, what memories they wake up with, what names they still remember, what burdens they've shouldered in silence so the rest of us wouldn't have to. This isn't just Jack Weston's story. It's the story of thousands like him, fathers, brothers, neighbors, men and women who returned home with the weight of wars still pressing on their shoulders. And all they ask in return is not applause, but understanding. Let's be the kind of nation that listens, not when it's convenient, but when it truly matters. So here's our question for you. Have you ever known someone like Jack Weston? Someone who never talked about what they'd done, but you knew they carried something deeper? Tell us about them in the comments. What do you remember most? What lesson did they leave you with? We read every comment, and sometimes your stories teach more than the video ever could. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you respect or someone you miss, please consider sharing it. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Silent Valor Stories. It helps us keep telling stories that deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching, and the next time you see someone walking quietly down the street in worn boots and a faraway look in their eye, maybe that's your Jack Weston. Maybe it's time we ask instead of assume.